What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. Welcome to episode 9 in season 2 of Real Democracy Now, a podcast. In today's episode, I'm talking to Associate Professor Sofia Näsström from the Department of Government at the Uppsala University in Sweden. Sofia works in the field of political theory, with particular focus on issues related to democracy, constituent power, the people, the right to have rights, representation, freedom, and precarity. She is currently working on a monograph entitled The Spirit of Democracy, Thinking Democracy Beyond the NationState. Sofia is a democratic theorist, and I talk with her about who is being represented in representative democracies, the difference between democratic and non-democratic representation, and her work identifying the spirit of democracy. Thanks so much for joining me today, Sofia. As you know, season 2 of the podcast is looking at representative democracy, and the initial episode considered democracy in ancient Athens, which was very much a direct democracy. You've suggested that the term representative democracy is a tautology. How so?
Well, what I want to say is that democracy is representative at its very core. I think this is an important point if you want to understand what sort of distinguishes modern democracy from that kind of direct democracy that we associate with Athens. We have come to think of representative democracy as a kind of second best. So democracy, real democracy, is direct democracy that we had in Athens. And then after the revolutions and with democracies that have to cover large spaces, we have to invent something like representation, indirect rule as a way to govern and as a kind of division of labor or filtering the will of the people through representatives. So real democracy is Athens, and then the second best is representative. I think this is wrong. I think that modern democracy is something very specific. It is, as I said before, representative as its core in the sense that, democracy in modern times is always mediated. We have to imagine the people. We have to claim it into being. We don't meet the Swedish people, the Australian people every day. We don't meet on the square. But this is something that we have to imagine. And we have to claim it into being. And I think the fact that no one in this sense can claim to be the people is important. Since the revolution, it has opened up a gap that has made it possible for new groups to make claims and make them part of democracy. And this is important because what distinguishes modern from ancient democracy is that it has been very vibrant. It has been connected with change, with fights, with struggles for ever more democratization of democracy, if you will. New groups have come in. Workers, women, black people, migrants, and so forth. So modern democracy doesn't come to a standstill. And this, I think, is due to the fact that it is representative at its core. It doesn't have a people there that exists in the way that it was more static in Athens. In Athens, it was much more static. There were a group of, citizens in the square. But in modern democracy, we have to imagine and claim the people into being. And this explains, I think, the way that modern democracy has moved, has sort of new groups have come into being, new claimants, but also new claims. So, we have seen how modern democracy has moved from claims of civil rights to political rights to social rights. So representative democracy is a tautology, as you say. It is representative at its core, and that is unique for modern democracy and something that makes modern democracy not, I think, a second best, but the best. It can be good if it works in the right way, so to speak.
And in what sense, what do you see as the tautology at the heart of the term representative democracy?
So in the sense that there is not a people. We often think of democracy as people rule, but the people, how to say it, the people is not there. It has to be claimed. So representative democracy is, modern democracy is mediated. It does not work without institutions that can sort of make us talk to ourselves through institutions and make up who we, the people, are.
I suppose your answer makes me wonder about your concept of representation. There's been, there's sort of the idea of a delegate, there's the idea of a trustee. What is your conception of the nature of representation in our democracy?
Yes, and I think that now you touched upon an important question when we talk about representation, because when we talk about the delegate trustee model, when we talk about different forms of representation, we often presuppose that the people is there, and then they can sort of indirectly rule in different ways. They can delegate their power, or they can, and that's one form of representation. But when I say that representative democracy is a tautology, I look at the people itself and say that the people itself has to be mediated. And that's a more fundamental way of understanding democracy, saying that we're not only looking at the institutional question, how do we, the relationship between representatives and represented, but also look at the represented, the people itself. And if we see that the people itself has to be claimed into being, then that is why sort of representative democracy is, modern democracy is represented at its core. In a deeper sense.
I'll just sort of try and tease out some aspects here. When we look at most representative democracies in the world today, we're looking at countries, states, where there's a certain level of suffrage and those people vote for their representatives. When you talk about the people need to be claimed into being, what is that related to who votes, or is it related to after the election how the elected representatives respond to the citizens in their jurisdiction?
It is neither. I
thought as much.
The institution of election, we always talk of election as aristocratic form, in a sense that we elect someone else who is a better self and so forth. And there's a whole discussion on that is very interesting, but that's not what I mean. I'm looking at the institution itself of universal suffrage. I think that when we talk about universal suffrage, what is it? It means that we choose who we, the people, are every 4 years. There's not a people there. But we need recurrent elections to say that, in fact, there is not a people there. It has to be recreated again and again, who we, the people, are. And that is what the institution itself means. It means that we need a mediating institutions like universal suffrage to recreate who we the people are every 4 years. Okay?
No, I've got it now. Thank you. That's really good. So look, Sofia, I'll move on to the next question. You've written about the need to distinguish between democratic and non-democratic forms of representation. Can you explain the difference and why it's important to recognise this distinction?
Yes. Today, representative democracies, and especially certain aspects related to it, like parties and the parliament, are very much criticized for not being able to truly represent the people. So there is an impatience and disappointment with representative democracy as a way of talking who we the people are, in the sense that it does not really connect to the worries and concerns that people have. And what has happened is that we elect representatives who are sort of our representatives, but what has happened is that new claim makers have come into being, and they are not elected. And sometimes in political theory, one talks about non-electoral representatives. It can be populist leaders. It can be social movements. Think of, Occupy was a very good example. We are the 99%. It can be NGOs, Oxfam, talking for poor people. It can be someone like Bono, that's a typical example, going to the G8 or G7 to represent, as he says, a lot of people who could not be there in the meeting, but who are marginalized and need a voice. So we see a lot of, with this sort of impatience with the parliamentary seen as the place where democracy is, we see a new of actors and groups coming in to claim to speak for the people. And they are important because they're important for two reasons. They point to the limits of the way we organize democracy today, that maybe there are marginalized voices, think of stateless persons or migrants who do not have a say, people who do not have citizenship, or are marginalized and don't feel represented. And they're important in the sense that they point to the limits of the contemporary structure of how we structure democracy today, also in relation to migration, globalization, and environmental questions that sort of cross national boundaries. Because parliament, and when we talk about representative democracy, they're so connected to nation states. So they are important in this respect. They're important also because they point to the fact, I think, and now I come back to this question of claim making, that representative democracy is about that. So here we see a new movement. I talked about how representative democracy has been able to move. It has been able to bring new claims into being because there is an opening there. No one really knows who the people are, and we can discuss that. Who are we, the people? And I think that what we see today, they are symptomatic. All these groups, these social movements that we see in the squares, they are symptomatic of a new movement, I think, but also of a new moment in the history of modern representative democracy. Now, that's fine. They're important in that sense, but we also, I think, have to see that not all claims to represent the people or to instantiate the people, because some people say, some groups say that they are the people, they may not always be democratic. So they may foster allegiance to more authoritarian forms. There are populist leaders who sort of claim to instantiate the people, and they may not be favoring equality and democracy. So how can we tell? When we sort of move out of the electoral arena and see a lot of different actors claiming to speak for the people and claiming to speak for democracy, how can we tell the difference between someone claiming to represent the people and someone who also does it but does not? And I think this is a very important question today. And I think that the difference here has to do with whether you personalize politics or whether these actors, because I think they might be leaders. Some people may go forward, they may go before others, and we've always had that. I mean, even some women who wanted to claim suffrage for women had to go forward. I mean, they didn't have to wait for every woman to stand by them to claim women vote. And the same thing we see today. We see some groups and actors taking the lead, so to speak. But are they democratic? And here I think is important. I think that the difference has to do with, do they, these actors and leaders, seek to create institutions that allows us to share the responsibility for deciding and judging what is right and wrong in the absence of natural and other authorities? Do they create institutions that allow us to share that power of deciding what is right and wrong? And that is what universal suffrage, human rights, the public sphere was all about. Everyone has an equal share in deciding through a vote, but also in judging through voice. And I think that's the key question today. In the urge for new institutional innovations and reforms, do these actors and leaders try to sort of subsume power to themselves or a certain group of people, a distinguished group of people, or do they rather create institutions that allow us to again find ways of mediating who we the people are through equal rights to vote and voice?
So the next question really goes to your current work. You're currently writing a book called The Spirit of Democracy, Thinking Democracy Beyond the Nation-State. Can you describe what the spirit of democracy is, and how does this conceptualization of democracy support a new conception of citizenship?
The term spirit, I mean, it can mean different things. We may come to think of spirituality or the spirit of reason that marches through history, the force of reason in Hegel. But I mean something very specific when I talk about the spirit of democracy. The term spirit has to do with what Montesquieu wrote in his book, The Spirit of Laws. And what Montesquieu, let me say something about the word spirit and then come back to the question of what I mean by the spirit of democracy. What Montesquieu meant by the term spirit is sort of, he distinguishes between different forms of governments, republics, monarchies, and despotic forms of government. And he says that each of these forms has a particular spirit that sort of makes it sustain over time and be alive, so to speak. And the spirit is connected both to who governs, the king in a monarchy, the body of people in a republic, and the despot in a democracy. But also, it needs something, a public commitment or a public spirit, let's call it that has to be sustained through institutions and actors. The institutions have to create action orientations that sort of foster this public commitment, and human beings, citizens, have to enact it and act upon it. So in a despotic government, for instance, fear is what has to be there in order for the despot to sustain his power. In a monarchy, it is honor and distinction, the desire for titles and social status and distinguish between upper and lower classes and so forth. And in a republic, it is virtue, public virtue. We have to stand up for the country and the laws. We have to love our country and laws in order for the body of the people in the republic to govern. Okay, so that's Montesquieu. And he sort of died before the American-French Revolution. The question I pose in this book is, what then is the spirit of democracy, the one that we know since the American and French Revolution? And my argument is that the spirit of modern democracy is not, as we often think, that it's connected to republicanism, that when it comes down to it, when democracy is threatened, we have to rebuild our love of country and laws. I think that is a mistake. Modern democracy is a spirit of emancipation. And modern democracy is a tough thing. What happened in the revolution was that with sort of the taking of power from the king and his divine right, modern democracy was formed through the awareness that there is no outer or divine, natural, or historical source that can tell us who we, the people, are. But we have to decide that for ourselves. We have to take responsibility for deciding and judging what is right and wrong in the absence of a divine authority, natural authority, and so forth. And this is quite tough. We can't rely on an authority in this sense. But this is relieved, I think, in modern democracies because we share that. And that is what universal suffrage and human rights is, that we share the responsibility for deciding and judging what is right and wrong in the absence of any other authority that we can rely on, be it a personal authority or some other authority. So the spirit of democracy has to do with emancipation in this sense, that we create institutions where we become emancipated from other political or other worldly sources and natural sources for deciding who we the people are. We really have to meet face to face to come together to understand what we think. So it has to do with both equality and freedom to begin again.
The title of your book talks about beyond the nation state. Why do you specifically feel that the spirit of democracy requires us to think beyond the nation state? Could it not apply equally within a nation state?
It could, and I think it has. But I think what is important to see is that modern democracy is, in a sense, as I said, there is not a body of people there. It is classless in a sense. So what happened with modern democracy is that you could start to compare yourself with across social classes. So suddenly, through the modern revolutions, poor people or workers could start to compare themselves with nobles, women, with men. You could start to sort of travel across, equality could travel across classes of peoples. And it moved, so to speak. It was a verb. You can democratize and make yourself comparable with people. You cannot say that this is one people and this is another people. And I think the same thing applies today. So why should democracy stop at the borders of nations as different classes of peoples. I think there's something very universal in the modern understanding of democracy that sort of allows us to compare ourselves across classes, and that's important when we talk about the spirit of democracy.
And in terms of a new conception of citizenship, is that specific? Does that go predominantly to that concept of equality and freedom, or are there other aspects that you see arise for citizenship from thinking about democracy differently?
So today, citizenship is a critical issue in the future of democracy, because I think how we conceive of citizenship is going to tell us something about how democracy will look like in the future. Today, when nation-state raise the question who should be a citizen and not, and they raise criteria for people to become citizens, they often think of there being a very sort of strong line between us and them. So the citizens are on the inside, and then we raise criteria for citizenship for those who are on the outside. That is a very wrong way of seeing it, I think. I think that the way we conceive, the criteria we use for deciding who is a citizen and not, will reproduce our own democratic self-understanding. It says something about us. So what qualifies someone as a citizen? Today we see many countries sort of using, I would say, republican and monarchical liberal ways of understanding. For instance, to be citizens, you must love the country and the law. You must understand the history. You must like it. Not only understand, you must like it. Or you must have merit and distinction. You must have money. Also, we have these kinds of criteria are becoming much more common today when we talk about citizenship. And I think that's very problematic. If we start to think of citizenship as someone who can pay for it, who has the right education, we should remember that in Sweden, for instance, as late as 1945, people who were on poverty relief did not have the right to vote. They did not have the right to vote. So what we do through these criteria is that we reproduce our own democratic self-understanding, and it will have a boomerang effect on the democracy on the inside as well. And that is why looking at citizenship is crucial if you want to understand the reproduction of democracy or the reproduction of more nationalistic or even sort of liberal monarchical forces. That's one thing, that citizenship is crucial for this. And I think that emancipation is another way of looking at it. It's looking not to reproduce nationhood or liberal monarchical principle of honor and distinction, what money does, for instance, but to say that can we share this responsibility for deciding it with people who are not citizens? And that immediately raises the question of democracy beyond the nation state. And when it comes to citizenship, I think it is not possible to have each country decide this for themselves, which is the system that we have now. We must in some way harmonize this decision and judgment of who can become a citizen and not, or we will force people into camps and deprive them of their human dignity. And this is something, of course, that Hannah Arendt knew a lot about. And I agree with her when she says that we need a new law on earth to come to terms with this question. So yes, migration has made citizenship crucial, and citizenship and how we conceive of it is going to be crucial for the reproduction or non-reproduction of democracy.
Does it flow from what you've said, perhaps not in the short term, but in the longer term, that we need global government? And one of the problems by having nation states, each of which have their own government, that it supports the idea of people who are part of that nation, citizens of that nation state, and people who aren't citizens of that nation state. Do you see that as the sort of long-term outcome of the sort of thinking you're promoting?
That's a very tricky question, how it will look like. And some people do not like this idea of global government. I think that at least what we need is to harmonize and to find arenas for discussing and judging these questions in some way on the global level. But I also think that one of the advantages with thinking of democracy as not based on this sovereign body of people, but on the spirit, where we need institutions that can harmonize, is that we can think of citizenship is something that can be discussed on different levels in this. But I agree, this is a tricky question, and I don't have a clear-cut answer to it. But in either case, it has to be harmonized. So even though we will live with states in the future, their role might be different. They may not be supporting nationhood, the states, but they may be promoting democracy. But we don't have to need one big democracy, so to speak, on the global level for that to work.
And one of the things I've talked to other people about is this issue of the actual power in practice of the government of any nation state in the current setting of so much global capital. And I guess in a way your concept of thinking of democracy beyond the nation state, do you think that could help with this power imbalance between individual governments and multinational corporations?
Yes, definitely. And I think this is one of the things that make democracy be on the losing side today. But what people see who lives in nation states is that power has also moved elsewhere. Power is not in parliament where our representatives reside. Power is elsewhere, and that has to do with global capital, for instance, and they can move free. So democracy is sort of tied to a nation state, but capital is not. And there is power in capital. And this is what people see. And not only global capitalism, we can talk about other problems that we see, environmental problems and so forth. So there is an asymmetry between the issues that we care for as citizens and what those governments that we have elected can do, given their separation, so to speak, on Earth. And I think that unless democracy is in some way globalized, it makes democracy look weak. It makes democracy not being concerned with people's worries, not being able to solve the problems that we wanted to solve. So this is a key issue, what you just said, and crucial also for the future democracy.
Sofia will also be part of a later episode considering the relationship between democracy and capitalism. In next week's episode, I will be moving from considering theory by taking an empirical turn with Professor John Keane, talking about his work on monetary democracy. And just to be clear, that's not monetary democracy, it's monitory democracy. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.
What do we want?